Hello again, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the life and career of George Tuska. Recently with this podcast, we've been focusing on the lives of some of the less heralded creators in the comic book industry, those without the name recognition like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, or Steve Ditko. Like all industries, comic books are filled with the great working men and women who delivered consistent quality work for decades, leaving their own small mark on the medium. One of those was George Tuska, an artist who worked from the golden age of comic books all the way to the 1990s, bragging that he only missed 2 weeks of work throughout his career. Tuska would leave his mark on comic strips and books, illustrating everything from Buck Rogers to Iron Man. He was a professional dad who treated comic books like a job, as he used it to pay his mortgage and support his family, all while, like those like him, leaving his own small mark on the great comic book medium. George Tuska was born on April 26, 1916 in Hartford, Connecticut. His mother was Anna Onosky, who immigrated from Russia to New York City, where she met George's father, Harry Tuska. After marrying, the couple moved to Hartford, where George was born. Anna worked for an electrical company, while George was a foreman at an automobile tire company. George Tuska was the youngest of 3 children, with one older brother and one older sister, Peter and Mary. Their father died when he was just 14 from bleeding ulcers, a condition George inherited, but thankfully his own children didn't. After a while, George's mother, who was a talented cook, decided to start a restaurant in Paterson, New Jersey, where she had several relatives, with many of the customers being from a nearby silk factory. And a classic bit of the first rule of business, location, 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 as there were no other restaurants nearby. And young George Tuska would help design the menus. His mother would later remarry. Growing up, George loved his brother's Peter's pulp magazines, especially the illustrations, and when he had an appendix operation at the age of 8, a fellow elderly patient at the hospital taught him how to draw, especially Uncle Sam, cowboys, and Indians. While no one else in his family was autistic, and his mother didn't encourage his new passion, she didn't discourage it either, thus leaving George free to pursue it. He would say his mother was very strict overall, but they remained close throughout their lives. It was also around this time that George Tuska had scarlet fever, which led to his hearing loss, despite what many believe it being from his service in the Army in a training accident. One of his earliest jobs, George Tuska remembers, was having to pick tobacco on a farm with his mother 10 miles north of the Hartford, with his fingers turning black from the tar by the end of the day. Tuska would move to New York when he was 17 to live with his cousin Annie. He got his first job designing women's jewelry and would later go to the National Academy of Design on the recommendation of a friend when he was 18, where his classmates were Jack Kirby. By this point, George Tuska started to develop his own artistic style, which was influenced by the likes of Thomas Lowell, Lou Fine, and Hal Foster. Originally, he wanted to be a magazine illustrator, like many artists at the time, but his career would have other plans. George Tuska would marry Dorothy Isabel Herbona, whom he met at a local YMCA dance in 1947, followed by dinner of hamburgers. They married on February 8, 1948, and would have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, Barbara born in 1949, Kathy in 1954, and Bob in 1956. They later moved to Hicksville, where they bought a house and lived there for 33 years. While we reveal George Tuska's art today, to him and many of his peers, it was just a job to put food on the table. Tuska's work constantly throughout his entire professional life, proudly stating he only missed 2 weeks of work due to bleeding ulcers, which killed his father. For relaxation, he enjoyed playing golf, often going to the club at 3:30 a.m. in the morning to get his tea time, and then returning home to work for several hours before showing up for his game. George Tuska first broke into the comic book industry working for Eisner and Iger Studios, the famed comic book packager that produced features to be sold to publishers, which he did for after school for $10 a week. His first known published work was Fox Comics' Mystery Men Comics No. 1 and Wonderworld Comics No. 4 in August of 1939. While at Eisner and Iger, Tuska even was able to write scripts for them, such as Shark Brody and Zanzibar the Magician. Tuska would later work for Will Eisner when he left his partnership with Bob Iger to work on his Spirit strip, along with working at the Harry Chesler's studio from 1939 to 1940 for $22 a week. Tuska would state one of his fondest memories was working with Will Eisner and the story and character ideas they came up with at the time. Around this time, George Tuska both penciled and inked while also working for studios like Quality Comics and Victor Fox, which he did through Eisner and Iger. Soon he was making $42 a week from Chesler Studios after working after just 6 months. While there, he gained recognition for knocking Bob Powell, a fellow artist best known for his work on Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, and Mr. Mystic, out for bothering him, who was going around the studio shadowboxing and challenging people. Tuska would briefly leave comic books, believing they were a fad, and would disappear in 2 to 3 years for advertising work before returning, where he worked on Shadow Comics for Street and Smith and Captain Marvel Adventures number 2 through 4 in 1941 for Fawcett. Tuska later joined Fiction House's Bullpen full-time, which was developed so that the company didn't have to rely on Eisner and Iger Studios for comic book features, where he did work on Sheena, Queen of the Jungle for 6 years. In 1942, George Tuska was drafted into World War II, where he served as a private first class for the 100th Division, drawing and enlarging artillery plans for officers. He was stationed at Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina, and was served for a year before being honorably discharged, much to the disappointment of his fellow soldiers. Reportedly, he was popular on base for drawing, naughty pictures. After his discharge, George Tuska returned to Fiction House while also working at Standard Publishing before moving on to Liv Gleason, where he worked in the classic crime comic book Crime Does Not Pay, which would be famously targeted by the CCA years later. His run on Crime Does Not Pay would make Tuska one of the premier comic book artists of the time, first doing backup features before drawing the lead stories and more by Crime Does Not Pay number 50 on March of 1947. While Tuska was most popular for this, he was also doing numerous other Gleason books as well, including Daredevil comics, which had no relation to the future Marvel character, though Tuska would eventually pencil him as well. John Romero loved his work on Liv Gleason, and his reputation of Crime Does Not Pay would lead to future works, notably at the future revived Marvel comic. George Tuska first started working for Marvel when it was called Timely, and transitioned to being called Atlas in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There, Tuska worked on Western and Jungle comics, where he inked his own pencils. His first confirmed work there was Justice Has a Heart and Casey Crime Photographer in August of 1949. Soon he was penciling all genres for the company, such as crime, westerns, horror, and military, on such books as Crime Can't Win, Black Rider, Strange Tales, and Battle. However, during the downturn of the comic book sales in the early 1950s, he was cut. Thankfully for Tuska, he was getting work in another related medium, comic strips. From 1954 to 1959, George Tuska took over as writer-artist on a newspaper strip, Scorchy Smith, about a pilot for hire and his adventures across America, fighting criminals and rescuing damsels in distress. The series was created by John Terry, who was inspired by the Charles Lindbergh's first flight across the Atlantic in 1927, and it passed to a number of artists before Tuska took the job. The strip would end in 1961, 2 years after Tuska left, but he had already moved on to another strip, Buck Rogers. Buck Rogers was originally created by Philip Francis Nolan, the pulp magazine Amazing Stories, in August of 1928, about the Great War, or World War I veteran Rogers, who finds himself transported 500 years in the future in the year 2419. After the success of the pulp stories and novels, Nolan next had the idea of serializing Rogers' strip, with Buck Rogers in the 25th century, beginning on January 7, 1929, with Dick Calkins as the artist, along with getting his nickname, Buck. The strip soon became popular, appearing in as many as 160 international newspapers and 18 translations. Tuska took over the art of the newspaper strip in April of 1961 and lasted until the strip's end in July of 1967. Which got him into the National Cartoon Society, where he got to play golf with Jackie Gleason in a celebrity tournament. Strips at the time required at least 12 weeks created in advance, a schedule Tuska found tiring, and he was ultimately glad when Buck Rogers ended, as by the time Tuska took over as artist, it was only appearing in 28 papers before its end on July 8, 1967. Buck Rogers has, of course, since appeared in numerous mediums ever since, with the great Frank Miller even slated to make a movie adaptation at one point. While Tuska himself would make his return to Marvel comic books. After Buck Rogers ended, George Tuska inquired at Marvel if they needed any artists, to which Stan Lee said, "Come on up." It was around this time Tuska decided to focus on penciling over inking, as he enjoyed that more. The company was now called Marvel, and Tuska's first credited work then was Tales of the Watcher and Tales of Suspense number 58 in July of 1964, with Stan Lee even giving Tuska an introduction heralding the return of the great golden age artist of the company. It would be the start of a celebrated career at the company. The inkers he most loved working with was Joe Sinnott, Mike Esposito, and Frank Giacomo, as Tuska started to make $45 to $55 per page. At Marvel, he was considered the best at drawing beautiful women. And along with his pencils in Tales to Suspense number 6 in 1964 would show, which also featured The Watcher and would later ink Jack Kirby on Captain America, which introduced the Sleepers, Red Skull's robots. Tuska later returned to the series on Captain America and the Falcon. His run on Captain America was so well regarded he was honored along with Gene Colan and John Romita Sr. by the American Association of Comic Book Collectors on July 21st, 2001 at the Hyatt Regency in San Diego. While Tuska preferred penciling, he would continue to ink from time to time when needed, such as when John Buscema on the Avengers, while also providing covers and pencils. During his run, he introduced the new Black Knight in Avengers number 47, December of 1967, with George Tuska providing his cover for the debut issue, which was created by Roy Thomas and John Buscema as a revival of the original character created by Stan Lee and Joe Manley. Tuska's run on the Avengers also included the origin of the Vision and the addition of Beast to the team. Tuska also worked on Uncanny X-Men with issue number 39 as on the cover, a run which included an Angel solo story written by Superman co-creator Jerry Siegel, and would ink Marie Severin's pencils on Incredible Hulk number 102, 105 through 106. He would even later pencil Incredible Hulk on number 218 and a couple of issues of Daredevil. Tuska also penciled 5 issues of Submariner and the cover for issue number 41. Perhaps George Tuska's most popular work at Marvel was his legendary run in Iron Man, which began on issue number 5 in September of 1968. He was noted for making his helmet emote, having it seem to smile or frown slightly to convey emotion, similar to how Deadpool's mask today is done. Tuska loved penciling Dr. Doom and the Mandarin and would continue on to the comic for almost 10 years with just a few brief interruptions, lasting until issue number 106 in January of 1978. During his run, he co-created the villain The Controller with the writer Archie Goodwin in Iron Man number 12 in April of 1969. Much of his pencils on this run was inked by Mike Esposito. While doing Iron Man, George Tuska will also pencil and co-created Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, which starred Luke Cage, the first black superhero to star in his own comic, which was written by Archie Goodwin on June of 1972. Then editor Roy Thomas and art director John Romita Sr. also helped with the creation. Created at the height of the blaxploitation era, Cage was an ex-convict who was experimented on in prison, leading to him gaining super strength and near unbreakable skin. After getting out of prison, he sets up shop as a hero for hire. By issue number 17, the series was changed to Power Man. He would pencil his own comic for 4 years, and leading up to issue number 47. By the next issue, the title was renamed Power Man and Iron Fist, teaming him with the martial arts expert Danny Rand in an attempt to combine the blaxploitation era genre with the martial arts one. It would be a classic pairing that has been repeated in comics ever since in other mediums, most notably in the Netflix series Luke Cage, in which the character was played by Mike Coulter. As for Tuska, he and Marvel would also try to repeat the successes with the Black Goliath, about Bill Foster, a professor who has size-changing powers similar to Hank Pym Ant-Man. Foster was originally created by Stan Lee and Don Heck in Avengers number 32 on September of 1966, while his Black Goliath persona was created in Luke Cage Power Man number 24 in April of 1975 by Tony Isabella and George Tuska. The next year, Marvel and Tuska tried to launch his own comic with Black Goliath, but it only lasted for 5 issues, with Tuska penciling the first 3. Another character that George Tuska co-created for Marvel was Shanna the She-Devil, who first appeared in her own comic in December of 1972, this time with writer Carol Schuling, the ex-wife of Phil Schuling, the noted comic convention planner and creator of the direct market. She was part of a trio of female characters Marvel was launching at the time, which included Night Nurse and Claws of the Cat, in an attempt to appeal to more female readers by Stan Lee. Tuska also penciled the first issue, with Ross Andru taking over afterwards, about the daughter of a diamond miner who grew up in the jungles of Africa, adopting the name Shanna the She-Devil to fight poachers. The character has made sporadic appearances in Marvel ever since, eventually marrying fellow Marvel jungle hero Kazar and having a son while defending the Savage Land, a part of the Marvel universe where dinosaurs still exist. Tuska got to work with Spider-Man on Hostess Twinkie ads in 1976, along with penciling the Amazing Spider-Man newspaper strip for 2 weeks, but his dislike for working on newspaper strips at this one made it a short run. Soon, George Tuska had become the utility player at Marvel, filling in when needed, whether it be on Strange Tales or The Defenders. He also worked in the black and white magazines, such as Tales of the Zombie, Monsters Unleashed, and even Dracula's Final Issue. These also included the first 6 issues of the Planet of the Apes adaptation in 1974, where he was tasked to alter the lead character to not look like Charlton Heston from the film.